Oh, there we go. Oh my gosh, this is
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Think Outside podcast presented by Bates.com. You know, every week it seems like I'm saying we have another very special guest, and it seems like there's actually a fact that we just have a lot of special guys on our team. Hopefully he loads in just a second.
Hey,
Brent, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So I know you're kind of wrapped up, a phenomenal finish at Kentucky Lake. You're just getting back home to California. Really appreciate you joining. I guess I would really like to just kind of start from the top. I remember talking to you. I think we might have talked to the event briefly. You're having a tough practice. Even in the videos you were posting, it was a really tough practice, but you were still able to catch him. Do you kind of want to just talk about the week in total? It just seemed like it was kind of meant to be. A third place finish is a great finish in a BPT Tour event. And I guess you just want to kind of start from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kentucky Lake has, gone through this crazy downswing. The fishing was terrible there for a number of years.
Yep.
Partly to do with the grass carp or Asian carp. I don't know what they actually had in there. It was the crazy infestation, which killed off a lot of the shad.
Yeah.
All the shad are gone. Then that kills off the, the bass. The bottom line, the carp are like a plankton eater, and they ate the plankton. Well, that's what the shad have to survive on to eat. So, you decrease the food, then, the shad die off. Well, then guess what? The shad are the food for bass. So the bass died off. So it was just this,
exactly.
At this point now, it was a 8-year swing of the fishing being pretty bad out there at Kentucky Lake. And
which is crazy. Even, not to interrupt you, but even when you were younger, I wasn't in Tennessee by then, but everyone I've ever talked to, it was phenomenal, wasn't it? Like, it was the best it could be, right?
Yeah, Kentucky Lake is really a fun lake. That's where I learned how to Tennessee River ledge fish, how to find them, where to find them, how to catch them. That was where, at the time I was fishing FLW, and we went there every year. I'm surprised we didn't go there twice a year for how many times we went there. So, here we are back to, heavy tie-in with Major League Fishing and FLW. And, we're back to fishing the Tennessee River a lot, which includes the upswing of Kentucky Lake, which it seemed like last year it was when things kind of seemed to turn back around. Now,
definitely.
When we say that, so they've had several tournaments there last year and the year prior, but it was early in the year. It was in March. Well, apparently the smallmouth fishing there is unreal right now, which is kind of funny, but that was in March. I have friends that live out there. Brandon Hunter, who's a really good friend of mine, he told me 2 years ago that he still was not catching them out on ledges. And, when they announced the schedule here, I wasn't allowed to call Brandon and ask him how it was. I couldn't ask him information about, hey, are they still on ledges? But based on the track record, it sounded like it was getting better. So when we, roll out there first morning of practice, I just go out and start, putting time on my Mercury. Really, I started the event with, I think, 60 some hours on my engine, at the start of practice. And by the end of the tournament, I had over 100 hours. So think about 2 days of practice and 4 days of tournament. I put 40 hours on that motor. That's a lot of time sitting down at the big engine. So
you only had 2 days of practice, right? So what are they, 15-hour days you can practice or so, or is it even longer?
15 hours is about what I fished. And so in 2 days of practice, I probably put, I would say, 24 hours on the engine in 2 days.
That's crazy.
With a total amount of 30 hours available, I put 24 on there. So, that's how I practiced there. And the reason why I say practice was so tough for me is that in past history, whether at Kentucky Lake or whether it was at Lake Chickamauga or Gunnersville, I could find a handful of schools a day. And I mean, at Kentucky Lake in its heyday, I would find 10 schools a day, which is a lot. So 2 days of practice, you have 20 schools. I'm talking schools of 20 to several hundred fish in a school,
Wow.
that, you can pull up and catch them every cast if they're ready to fire. And I went out this time to 2 days of practice, finding what I felt like were 2 legit schools and, 3 or 4 spots that I thought I might be able to catch one. So we're talking 5 or 6 spots total to fish the tournament, and I go back to the times when Kentucky Lake was really good and I would have 20, 30 schools to fish. I might only catch them on maybe 3 to 5 spots out of the 20. So now when you're looking at that 5 spots, I'm sitting there thinking, doing the math in my head going, well, out of 5 spots, I might have one.
One that's right and will fire, right?
Correct. Or you're running down the lake, and it did happen in this one. I ran down the lake to some stuff that was a little farther away that I wanted to fish, and there's a guy on the first spot. There's a guy on the second spot. So, we find the same areas. So with 20 spots, you have, 5 or 8 of them that are, have boats on them. And then 5 or 8 of them are not good. So now you're down to 3 spots that are good. Well, when you have 5 and there's a guy on 3 of them, you're down to 2. And out of those 2, one of them might only be good. So it was pretty tough. And the weights and how everyone caught them really didn't actually show how tough I thought it was going to be. When the tournament started, I honestly thought that if you caught 15 to 20 pounds a day, you were going to cash a check. And I thought it was going to take 25 pounds a day to make the knockout round. And I want to say it took about 30 pounds a day to get a check. And I think it took, probably close to 70 or 80 pounds. So almost 40 pounds a day to make the knockout round, so it was almost double what I thought.
That's insane.
So, it ended up being a really good event. Kentucky Lake is definitely back. I don't think it was necessarily the fishery that made it tough. I think they've had a lot of high water and flooding early in the season, even up until just recently. And when you have high water, flooding, tons of current, when the fish get done spawning, they don't flood the main lake as quickly as they do with a normal situation, normal current, normal, water level. It delays them. So for the fact that it delayed them, I think that if you went out there right now, things are a little bit more stable, a little bit more time, even in the next 2 weeks, it's going to be really good out there on the main lake ledges.
Totally. Were the ledges you were kind of finding, I guess a couple spots you did find, were they more, near the backs of the creeks, kind of right in front of the creeks? They weren't really on the main ledge. Is that correct? Like the
correct.
main,
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. You're totally right on that. In the past, I would look a lot on the main river or, main lake, related. I mean, it may not be on the actual main river channel next to a main river buoy that the barges look at when they're going up and down the river, but it'll be nowhere even close or related to a that main river channel or going into related to, let's say, a main lake creek point. It's related to a creek or a secondary point. I haven't really caught them in like that before until this time. I definitely did have, 2 spots that were more creek related, but not in a creek.
Yeah.
And, what really helped me on the final day to get a 3rd place finish is that I ended up catching them really well on day 3, the knockout round in the morning. And it allowed me to relax and go out and practice during the 3rd period of the tournament. So I knew I had enough weight. So I just pulled the plug quick, to quit catching them. And I went out and started looking again. And I ended up finding 2 more schools that, I utilized there on the final day. And I think I had right at 70 pounds on the final day. And I probably caught 20 of it off of the new schools that I found. So,
Oh, wow.
that helped. Think about, I didn't look at where I would have been if I caught 20 pounds less than what I actually had, but it for sure was not third place. I know that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a lot less money in your pocket. Totally.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I honestly remember watching you I believe it was the knockout round on Saturday. So I guess it would be Friday. Did you have a tougher day on the first day? I kind of want to have the timeline correct. Was it a tougher day on the first day of the tournament, that Thursday for you, or did you catch?
It was the second day. So the first day I caught him pretty well. I want to say I had 50 some pounds on day one.
I thought you struggled one day from what I remember.
Correct. The second day of the tournament, which would have been Friday, I had one bass at noon, and I started to run some other areas, and a school that I was saving because I knew no one was going to find. I ran to it, and of course there was a guy on it. I ran somewhere else. I was able to catch a couple crank and a Lucky Craft plug, and then I ran back to it, and he was gone. I looked around, the fish were gone. I never had a bite there, and ran back up the lake again, and ended up catching a few more, and then just barely made it in. I mean, I was out of the knockout round with 15 minutes to go, and I made one more run to another spot and caught two on the Lucky Craft plug to get me into the knockout round.
Gosh, that's incredible. I mean,
yeah,
really right at the end, right?
Yeah, with 6 minutes to go, I was out of the knockout round, and I caught one more with 5 or 6 minutes to go, and that kept me in. So
what's going through your head during that time? Like I couldn't even imagine the amount of pressure that's just mounting.
It is tough, and
how do you handle it?
Well, what made it worse is with 30 minutes to go, I lost a 4.5 pounder, and
I saw that one. Yeah,
that killed me because this year alone, I've had so many. I mean, every year we have it happen, but lost fish that cost me, cashing the top 30, $10,000 check, or I missed the knockout round, which puts me in the top 20. I get to fish the next day, which just qualifying for the knockout round jumps that money up, and I miss it by 1.5 pounds, and I lose 4 over the course of 2 days. That any one of those fish out of the 4 would have put me in the knockout round. So, I go to Red Crest, and I lose one fish that cost me 2 places, which was a total of $10,000. So you have so many of these lost fish that that don't. Now, granted, we all do. That's fishing. But when you're putting a $sign next to a lost fish,
it really hurts. Yeah.
I'm right there on the bubble to make the knockout round. With just making that knockout round alone is a $5,000 jump, going from just cashing a check to doing that. You lose a 4-pounder with 15 minutes to go, and you're out of the cut. Your head immediately goes to, I'm not going to make the cut to fish the knockout round, and therefore I lose $5,000. So
I could even imagine.
So I lose a 4-pound fish. It was a 4.5, 4 3/4. I lose that fish. I don't make the knockout round. I make $10,000 in the tournament.
Yeah.
I make the knockout round, and it increases up to 15. Well, guess what? I make it to the knockout round. I get that 15. Well, not only do I get that 15, I advance to the finals.
Because you won the knockout round, which is crazy.
Yeah. But you look at the check difference between not making the knockout round to making the knockout round, end up making the finals, finishing third. It's a $25,000 swing right there. And that was, where your head goes. So the stress level is very high. You lose fish and just not capitalizing on opportunities.
Exactly.
Is what makes it really hard, what we do. So,
and it also makes it really interesting for the consumer to watch, in my mind. Like, for me to watch is just like, it's a roller coaster. And I think about what's going on in your mind. I'm like, I couldn't even comprehend it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It makes for great, TV, great watching for sure.
Exactly. So I guess the knockout round comes. you win it. Can you kind of talk? I mean, it seemed like, for at least from what I watched, the couple hours you smashed him on this one spot. Kind of what was that spot? What made it so special? Did it play for you in the final day? If you want to explain that, would be awesome.
You got it. So it was a school that I found late in the day on the second day of practice, and I fished it on day one and maybe caught about 15 pounds there. Day two, I only caught one there, and then I went back on day three, and they were fired up and ready to go. But the one change was that I was able to use my Garmin, forward facing, my Panoptix Live, and the fish were just set up right, and I ended up catching a lot of them on the minnow that I hadn't really caught that many on it up until this point. I've been I was catching them cranking, I was catching them throwing a hair jig and drop shot, and all the standard issue stuff for ledge fishing. But I hadn't really found them wadded up to where I could use the minnow during my forward facing period. So it was kind of the perfect storm. I was able to get there. They were wanting to eat. They were set up right based on the current, and I was able to throw the minnow out there. And not only just the minnow, I mean, I caught them on the drop shot and NACO and different things on the spot, but I knew where to make the cast. That was the biggest difference.
Gotcha.
And, it really did play. They were set up right. And I caught every fish I could. There was no saving anything because it didn't matter to me. I would rather make that the final round and burn everything I got than try to conserve it and not make the cut. So exactly. I burned them. I leaned on them pretty hard. I definitely hurt their feelings. They did not want to bite very well after that. And I mean, I get it. I caught a lot of fish there, and I was fishing for the fish that I'd already caught. So, that changes things.
Oh, definitely. And then you win, and it's the knockout round, if I'm not mistaken, correct? You win the knockout round, qualifies you for the final day. Kind of what went down the final day, then we'll really start talking about finesse fishing and all that cool stuff. But kind of what happened the final day? I mean, you caught 70 pounds off. Would it be 3 or 4 schools? That's
I caught them on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spots. Five spots. Because I found 2 more during that knockout round. Instead of having 3, I had 5 spots to run to.
Yeah.
And a couple of them were not very good. One of them was good, but it got beat up. There's another competitor to fish in the same spot, or more. I don't know. But, we beat those fish up. I caught 30 pounds on that spot one day and went back the next day and hardly caught anything. So the fish were getting beat up a little bit. But what I learned is that a lot of these spots, you could catch them fairly quickly, and then they would shut down, just about as fast as they started.
Wow.
If you left and you were able to let them rest, you could come back and catch a few more. So I started on a spot, was able to catch a few, get my day rolling, ran somewhere else, caught a few there.
Yeah.
Ran, everywhere I ran, I could catch them. And what was tough about Kentucky Lake, and, I would say it's one of the worst places in the country for this, is that people love to get out and watch. Well, when you leave a spot to let it rest, people love to go fish it. You have 3 or 4 boats watching you, and you leave to go run to a new spot to let the spot rest, and you come back, and the guy that just watched you for 45 minutes is now fishing the spot. When you think it's resting, he's sitting there fishing it. So
you had a local fishing the spot after
you? Oh, absolutely. It happened.
In the tournament?
It happened twice just on the final day, where someone watches you. They're sitting there with binoculars, not fishing, watching, and then you leave and come back, and they're just,
hunkered down there.
Down and fishing. So the whole time where you think the spot's resting, it's not. And therefore, those fish, when you're trying to time things, when you come back, there is no rest, because those guys are just sitting there fishing. And, that happened, like I said, twice on the final day. And it gets tough when you're trying to run around and let those fish set up, because when you come back, you can almost catch them on your first cast. I can't tell you how many times I caught them on the very first cast.
Just kind of get lined up. You're like, they should be right here, make that cast, and you catch one.
And they're there, they're hot. You catch 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they shut down. And then you leave and go somewhere else, and you catch 1, 2, or 3. You leave and come back, you catch one more,
Yeah.
So had a really good spot. I leave it, let it rest. I go catch a few more fish, come back. The guy that was watching is now sitting there fishing. I leave and go back somewhere else. I come back. He's not there. Don't get another bite. But when I don't get a bite, I waste 15, 20 minutes fishing there,
Exactly.
and that hurts you. So it's kind of just a weird rotation on these spots and getting there when the fish want to bite. And you don't necessarily know when it's going to be, other than when someone's not casting there for a good little bit, whether it's 20 minutes, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, when you show back up, they want to bite. They're ready. They're down there with their mouth open, just waiting for something to fall in it. So,
Exactly.
it's definitely a game of rotating and showing up when they're ready.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. So do you think, like, after you catch a couple, like let's say 4 or 5, do you think they're still there? They're just not biting? Or do you think they've totally moved off the spot because they're seeing their buddies get yanked up out of a 10, 12 foot of water? And do you think they dispersed, or do you think they're just sitting there, like, hey, they're not talking to each other, but like, we're not biting, and then you leave, come back, and they're biting again? What do you think it is?
For the most part, they are there. Yes, sometimes they move, but they're not far.
Gotcha.
But now with Garmin and Panoptics, I'm able to see how those fish react. Where you're catching them really well, and then they stop biting. I can see them there. You can see them on Panoptics sitting there, just set up on the spot, ready to bite. And I had it several times when I was able to use forward facing, that they were sitting there ready, and I make the cast and I tell my official, I'm catching one right now.
That's awesome.
And I don't, because
Really?
they don't want to bite, even though they're set up right. But
Gotcha.
if you leave and come back and they're there and they're set up right and you make that cast, they start biting you. You can catch 5 and 5 casts.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. So, we kind of recap the event again. Congratulations. 3rd place. Phenomenal. Great check.
Thank you.
I remember we talked yesterday, Brent, about, finesse fishing, but how anglers nowadays, there's not a certain angler that is really good at one thing. Everyone is good at everything. And you kind of said it hurts you, but like, let's say you look at a guy like Denny Brower, he's a jig fisherman. David Fritz is a crankbait guy. For me, I kind of view you as a finesse guy, but you're good at it all. Can you kind of explain the evolution of how it, fishing kind of went from you're really good at one thing to now that you're got to be good at it all to compete at the highest level, right?
Yeah, I think that to survive, in a points race for a season, you have to be very versatile on your techniques. And I think that the newer generation of fishermen coming up are a lot more versatile than what they used to be. A guy grows up on, let's take like Andy Montgomery, for example. Grew up on Lake Norman. He is the best skipper, taking a jig and skipping on a bait caster that has probably ever lived. He's such a great fisherman. His hand-eye coordination is above anybody I've ever seen. But, at 2 years old, he could probably skip a jig, because Lake Norman is solid docks, and that's what they do there. He is really good at that, and he grew up a certain way. For me in California, we have clear water reservoirs. Finesse fishing was a big deal. The split shot was a really big deal when I first started fishing. That was the finesse way to catch them, was a split shot rig with a little 3-inch reaper as the worm.
Yeah.
And that progressed into a drop shot. But what we also have out here is the California Delta. That's grass, hydrilla, reeds, tules, flipping, heavy line, cranking, chatterbait. Then you have Clear Lake that, I fished tournaments at Clear Lake back in the day where I had a drop shot. I had 2 rods on the deck, a drop shot, and then a 9-inch swim bait. And you look at a drop shot, you have a 6-inch skinny robo worm that's nothing. Yeah. It's really small. And then you have a 9-inch swim bait that looks like a trout. And, that's your pattern. You're going to throw the big swim bait and you're going to throw the drop shot. It's very diverse. They have docks up there. They have tules. They have grass certain times of the year. So, you have a broad spectrum on what you're going to do. And because of that, it has probably helped me to be fairly versatile out there.
Yeah.
Like I said, the new anglers coming up right now are very versatile. I think the one thing that's different to that is because of forward-facing sonar and this new younger generation, I don't think that a lot of these guys could survive if they couldn't look at something 50 to 100 feet out in front of the boat.
For sure.
If they had to go out and turn that thing off and try to figure out how to go and, flip something here or crank something there or do that, I don't think they can necessarily survive when it came to a, 7 to 9 tournament season. But I do believe that angler now is more versatile than these guys that grew up with a specialty. We talked about Denny Brower. He was a phenomenal flipper. Fritz, who is famous for cranking, a specialist. I think that now we have less specialists into one technique. But
exactly.
The flip side, like I said, is that a lot of these newer guys are specialists at forward facing and throwing a jig head minnow.
Yep.
But as a whole, I would say there are fewer specialists out there.
No, definitely. So you kind of touched on, split shot fishing. I'd really like you to dive into finesse fishing. You kind of said that's what you started off with growing up. That was your kind of go-to thing. I don't even really know what a split shot rig is because I grew up throwing a drop shot. You know what I mean? Like when I was younger, I was watching you on TV or, any other drop shot fisherman. And that's what they use. I never even really heard of a split shot rig. Like what even is that?
So a split shot is essentially just a scaled down version of a Carolina rig. Carolina rig, you do a leader to a swivel, to a bead, to a 3/4 1 ounce weight bait caster, throw it out there.
Yeah.
The split shot rig was essentially what you did is you tied to a worm hook, you put the worm on there, and you take a split shot and you crimp it up your line, and instead of doing a 3 or 4 foot leader, you're only doing like, maybe not even 2 feet. Let's call it 18 inches, 20 inches of a span between your little tiny worm and the split shot. And then people realize, well, shoot, we're throwing 6-pound test. That split shot damages the line. So then what they did is they started using these Mojo weights that were long and skinny. And Mojo had these little threaders that you take a threader, you put that slip, sinker on your line. And you take this threader and you run it through there and you put a little piece of living rubber on there and you pull it through. So what it does is it just pinches that, that living rubber inside there and holds it in place without damaging your line. And, but that was essentially the split shot rig, is just a scaled down version of a Carolina rig.
Okay.
And reapers were a big deal. If you don't know what a reaper is, it kind of looks like a leech.
Yeah.
4-inch little worm, the 4-inch robo worm was really good. I mean, I can't tell you how many fish I caught on a split shot with a 4-inch robo worm, back in the day. I mean, we're talking back in, like the late 90s is when that was a big deal.
Gotcha.
And this is all prior to the drop shot coming out. We got the drop shot set up really from the Japanese anglers that came over to fish the U.S. Open. So I still remember the first time.
Really?
They would come over. A lot of the Japanese anglers would come over and fish the U.S. Open as co-anglers. And I practiced with a few of them and, fished with a few of these guys in the tournament. And I remember looking over and this guy's got a weight on the bottom and a hook above. I'm like, what is going on? They were the ones that showed us the drop shot rig. I mean, honestly, the
cool.
Japanese anglers was the ones that brought that over to the United States. And I mean, I bet you 3/4 of every pro fisherman in every tournament has a drop shot tied on.
100%.
Whereas
drop shot or Nico, right?
Yeah. And here we are 20, 25 years ago, no one even knew what it was.
So the Japanese guys kind of brought it over. You saw it in the U.S. Open. Where did it go from there? Like, when did you really start using it, and then you still use it today? Like, when are you like, hey, this thing is the deal? And then when did you kind of get paired up with Robo Worm and the 6-inch, straight tail, that's a staple in everyone's arsenal.
It definitely is. We're going to late 90s, early 2000s. I would say it was, about 2000, 2001 was probably when it was standard issue for me to have a drop shot rig. We were catching so many fish on it back then. The number one worm back then in 2000 was a 4-inch roboworm and like oxblood. That was like that was my staple. Well, actually, not even oxblood. It was the people's worm. Well, people's worm was the pro staff only. No one could get the people's worm colored. That was only for pro staff. And so I was tied in with the guys at Robo, so I was able to get them. I wasn't on their pro staff, but they would send me the people's worm. It was a little variation of the oxblood and oxblood like colored, through roboworm like that. But this people's worm was, it Lake Mead and the people's worm. Oh man, I caught so many fish on that thing on a little 4-inch, skinny roboworm.
Yeah.
And, shifted to, here we are now in 2025. And, back east, I don't even stock the 4-inch robo anymore. I just run the 6-inch skinny. It's just such a good worm,
Yeah, you have to.
Day in and day out. And, the colors, MM3 is a really good color. Oxblood, people's worm is still a really good color. Morning Dawn is such a good color.
Yeah.
Aaron's Morning Dawn, Red Crawler. There's so many different colors out there that are really good, just staples all over the country. And, there's two soft plastics that never leave my boat. The Senko is always in there. I have a big bag of, I promise you this bag weighs, 25 pounds of Senkos because I use them so often and it never leaves the boat. There's not one time in probably 20 years that I've not had a huge inventory of, the standard 5-inch Yamamoto Senko in my boat. Well, the other one right now that does not leave my boat is a bag of roboworms and, with a variety of colors in it because it's just one of those baits that just truly catches them.
So what would be, all over the country, you said the 6 inches good, the 4.5 inches kind of good out west. What is the one color, depending on whatever size, doesn't matter what size, but what is the one color you would take all over the country and catch fish?
That's a tough one. I would say back east is probably more along the lines of like MM3.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they like a little bit of those darker colors. Like a 5-inch Senko is just straight green pumpkin, man. Don't ever take that thing out of the boat.
Yeah.
For the roboworm, it probably would be MM3. They it's hard to say because I have a hard time only stocking one color of robo. That is
very fair.
Something that I will have. I would even have a hard time saying I had to narrow it down to one. I would have to narrow it down to probably 3, whereas with a Senko, I can narrow it down to just green pumpkin.
Exactly.
But with a robo, it's probably, MM3, Morning Dawn, and then probably maybe a Red Crawler or, Aaron's, Aaron has a color and I can't remember what it is. It's very similar to Red Crawler and I throw that one a lot, but I'm drawing a blank right now on what that color is called.
Is it Aaron's Morning Dawn? I might even have it behind me here.
I don't think it's that one because the Aaron's Morning Dawn has a pearl belly, right?
Pearl, yeah, more whiter belly for sure.
Yeah, not that one. It's more of a Morning Dawn color, but then it has kind of that brownish belly on it, like a Red Crawler, if that makes sense.
Is it Aaron's Magic? Is it that one?
It's not Aaron's Magic. Sorry, no, because Aaron's Magic is a green color. The color I'm thinking of is more of like a Morning Dawn color. Aaron's Magic is a phenomenal color, though.
It's a really good one.
Sorry, so maybe now it's 4. Aaron's Magic with Red Flake is such a good color. I've caught so many fish on that; it's ridiculous. But honestly, you could take 20 colors that they make and every one of them would probably work better. Obviously we have our confidence in, one certain color, but there's no way that, I could go out to a lake right now and look in my box and go, shoot, the only color I have is Aaron's Magic. Well, they're not going to bite it, though they will.
Yeah, they're going to bite
or
it.
It's MM3, they're going to bite it.
It doesn't matter. They're straight up going to bite it.
Yeah. They did such a good job, early on with making, that worm, it was the right place, right time, and they did it right. No one was really pouring, the hand pour guys were pouring the 3 color options. You look at other manufacturers out there where it was the injection molded, and your option was
2 or 1
a green pumpkin with black flake, watermelon with black flake, whatever it is. It was a 1 color pour because it was an injection
molding, right?
Molding, and you can't do a 3 color pour. So RoboWorm was ahead of the time. And what's funny is that people have come out with 3 color options right now, but RoboWorm still has the original, and it's still better than everything else out there.
Straight up a fish catcher. Do you kind of have any tips that you would like to, give out to the fans here of, maybe finesse fishing out west, or, even how you grew up finesse fishing, how it's helped shape your career? I guess that's kind of a 2-part question. I guess the first question, it would be, do you have any real tips for out west finesse fishing? Like, what have you done your whole life to really help you catch more fish?
Out west, there really, if you weren't finesse fishing, you weren't really catching them. For a lot of these lakes that we went to, a lot of pressure, a lot of clear water. Anytime you're presented with a clear water reservoir, you kind of need to scale things down a little bit, with normal situations, adverse conditions, wind, rain, overcast, whatever, you can usually upscale, start cranking a little bit, jerk bait, top water, whatever. But if you have a standard issue, sunny day, let's call it a post front or whatever, it doesn't matter, just clear, sunny, calm. You're not going to go out there and wind up, a Lucky Craft crankbait around and catch them. You're going to have to slow down a little bit. The 2 things, or the one thing that I really learned about clear water and finesse fishing, and this is something that I would think could really help people, even across the country. I'll give you an example. I was fishing Lake Mead. It was March. It was cold.
Mm-hmm.
The water was the clearest I have ever seen it anywhere in, my career. And when I say clear, I could see color change in 30, 40 feet of water.
What?
So if you think about being in any lake in the country right now, and your boat is sitting in 30 feet of water and looking straight down under the boat, you're not going to see a rock that's the size of a baseball on the bottom. Well, at this point in time, I'm looking at my graph and it says 30 feet of water, and I look down and I can see a rock that big sitting on the bottom. God. And I'm casting to shore and I'm not catching a single thing. And I go, well, I can see a rock this big right there. I can't see a bass. And I'm looking up here. I don't see a bass anywhere. So I looked at that and I go, well, why don't I cast to where I can't see him? And so instead of casting like this toward the bank, I just go straight in front of the boat and I throw the bait out in 35 feet of water and I get a bite on the sink.
What the heck?
I have used that as a general rule, and this really played a big factor of fishing the Major League Fishing Cup events where we don't have practice. You're out there and you have a 15-minute, whatever, 30-minute run time, and it's lines in, and you got to start fishing. You haven't practiced.
Yeah.
So I started to learn that as a general rule, I go to the end of a dock, and I look in the water, and wherever I can't see the bottom is where I'm going to start fishing. So if you look down and that's 2-foot visibility, I'm going to catch them in 2 to 5. If it's 10-foot visibility, I'm going to catch them in 10 to 15. If it's 20, I'm going to catch them in 20 to 25.
That's
there's something about the light penetration and how the fish hunt, meaning that, they're predators. They hide, they ambush. Well, if you can see everything, down to 5 feet of water, that means that their prey are going to see them in 5 feet of water. They're going to be where that light isn't necessarily penetrating as well as it is in that shallower water. So they use that light to their advantage to hunt. You know, they're smart. I mean, they have to hunt to live. If they can't hunt, they're not going to live. So it's basically, you know, it's a how to live situation for them. And that's one thing that I've always used as a general rule is that light penetration and where I can see in the water. I know they can see as well. So where things start getting harder to see, you don't have that light penetration is where they're going to be and where they're going to hunt.
Exactly where they're going to feed. That is a phenomenal tip. I didn't even ever think about that in my entire fishing career, if you want to call it that. That's really, really cool way to look at it. I just learned so much from that. Thank you. I hope everyone else does too.
Look, really there's cool. Always exceptions to the rule.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, day in and day out, there is no textbook standard way to do things. There is a textbook way of doing things, but we're always wrong in fishing. Exactly. But that's one thing that I've kind of, you know, put in my back pocket and utilized it quite a bit. And
all over the country, right?
All over the country. Yeah. And to me, it's just a great starting point, you know. And like I said, there's always exceptions to the rule, but without knowing anything, that gives me a place to start.
Definitely. Yeah, that's amazing. I love it. So I guess, Brent, to kind of close off the podcast here, how has, you know, finesse fishing really helped, you know, create your career, shape your career, how it is today? Like, you're a staple guy in my mind in the industry on the BPT tour. You're always near the top. How was finesse fishing, even when you were younger out in California, how has that helped, you know, transpire to who you are now as a fisherman, you know, being so versatile and all those things?
I think the biggest part is that I'm not afraid to do it. You know, it's a lot of the guys that, you know, I fish against, it's this crazy fear of finesse fishing. You know, they have a hard time doing it. I don't. It's something that I grew up doing. It's something that we do out west a lot.
Yeah.
So it was easy for me to do it back east. But the one thing about finesse fishing is that even if the fishing is good and you can catch them power fishing, you're going to catch them finesse fishing as well. You know, it's not like this, oh, well, they only bite a crankbait or you have to power fish heavy line and flip. That's not the case. They're still going to bite it. But guess what? When you have to finesse fish to catch them, you are not going to power fish to catch them. You will be able to catch them going, you know, when it's the fish are set up where you can power fish on the finesse setup. So it is one of those things that is more versatile, and, you know, day in and day out, there's a good chance you're going to catch more fish on it.
Exactly. Oh, that's awesome. Well, Brent, I don't want to hold you any longer. I really appreciate it. This was a phenomenal podcast. I've said phenomenal maybe 20 times, but it really was. Like, it was really cool. Kind of gave tips on Kentucky Lake. Then we really gave a bunch of tips and information on finesse fishing and how it helped shape your career. Yeah, I really appreciate you jumping on. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely, man. I appreciate it, and would love to be on again as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent.
Oh, there we go.